Hi, my name is Jake Johnson, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Musicological Society. And I'm excited to welcome you to our new JAMS author interview series. This series is designed to bring cutting-edge work of music scholars to a wider audience and to increase accessibility to and perhaps even curiosity toward the work that musicologists are doing today. Today, I am joined by Joanne Cormac, who is an associate professor of music at the University of Nottingham, to discuss her article, Regionalizing the Nation, the Symphonies of Franz Lachner and Emily Meyer in Relationship to German National Identity, which you can find in the summer 2025 issue of the Journal of the American Musicological Society, Volume 78, Issue 2. Welcome, Joanne. I'm happy to have you here as part of our program. I'm wondering if you could maybe begin by just giving a brief summary of this topic of your article and the argument.
Hello, Jake. Thank you so much for having me. My article is about the symphony in the 19th century in German-speaking lands. And so it's a big topic. It's a big canonical genre, and lots of people have written about it. But I'm trying to probe it from a slightly different angle by paying attention to regional differences in the way people thought about and responded to symphonies in Germany or German-speaking lands at mid-century. So we know that the symphony became really closely associated with German national identity, and it played a kind of unifying role. At the time, Germany was a group of different states and principalities and kingdoms, and there are lots of differences between religious differences, cultural differences, differences in the landscape and the kinds of jobs people did, all sorts of differences in different parts of Germany at the time. And the symphony is often seen as this cultural object that does this amazing work of bringing people together and being something that people in different parts of German-speaking lands can be proud of, and kind of expresses their sense of identity as something that, and it's kind of this serious genre that's quite different from Italian opera and kind of stakes out a role for kind of German national identity at the time. So I wanted to kind of look at this issue and think, well, does it do any other work in terms of German national identity at the time? Does it kind of represent different types of identities? Does it mean different things to different people in different parts of the north or in the southern states, in Vienna as opposed to Berlin? So that's kind of the angle that I was coming at the topic from. And to do that, I looked at two symphonies that haven't received an awful amount of attention, and they complicate kind of what we think we know about the symphony in different ways. So there's Franz Lachner's Symphony No. 5, which he wrote in 1835. And this symphony was generated lots of really rich material because it won a competition. It won the Symphony Prize of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna. And because it won a competition, it was performed a lot in lots of different cities, in the north and in the south, in Vienna and Berlin, all over the place. And so there is quite a rich reception record there. So you can see how people responded differently to it and how some people really didn't like it, particularly as you in Leipzig and in the center of Germany now. And as you go further north, people really didn't like it, didn't think it kind of chimed with what they thought a symphony was and should be. Whereas in Vienna, it did very well, and in other southern parts of Germany, like Munich, it was popular too. And so I could tease out what the symphony meant to different people in different places and how it spoke to their sense of identity. And then the other piece is Amelia Mayer's Symphony No. 3, her military symphony, which she composed in 1850. And this one's a really interesting one too, because it's composed at this time post the 1848 revolutions, when people are kind of fighting for a more sort of liberal vision of Germany and also more widely in Europe as well, and the ideas of kind of equality and more constitutional governments really at the forefront. But this in the short term anyway fails, and then we have this period of this more kind of reactionary period, more kind of conservative period politically. And Meyer's symphony talks to this more conservative time, or this is what I argue in the article, that it's kind of encapsulates this moment in Prussian Berlin. It's quite militaristic, and it's kind of supports this more kind of dynastical view of government. So it's these two different symphonies really complicate what we think about what the symphony is and what it means as a symbol of German national identity.
Yeah, reading your essay, I think many of us watching this might have a sense of the general story of how much how important the German national identity was to the formation of most of what we talk about in Western classical music. But this was such an interesting side angle into that story that really complicated it and enhanced it for me. And that was such a fascinating part of the read on my part. And I'm wondering if there was something that most fascinated or surprised you about this topic, or this general area of research you've been working on as you were developing it.
Well, I loved getting to know these pieces that are not canonical pieces, and there's not too much scholarship about them, particularly the Mayer piece. And I think she's a fascinating figure. She wrote 8 symphonies, and there's still not that much scholarship about them. There's some biographical work on Mayer, not that much really probing the music, although that's starting to change, and it's really wonderful to be part of that change. So it was really interesting to get to know her, and she never married. She didn't start learning music or having proper musical studies until she was about 30, so really quite late. But then she still managed to foster this support for her music. She had these very important, influential figures behind her, like A.B. Marx, really important figure in Berlin, and Wilhelm Wieprecht, who I talk about in the article, who was responsible for military music in the Prussian Empire. So these kind of very, very influential figures who were supporting her career. So to learn more about her was really, really fascinating. But then to also kind of place it against this more conservative time in which she was writing, and that tension there between her being quite a progressive figure in some ways, writing symphonies as a woman at the time, and also having to deal with making her symphonies palatable and suitable to these high-class spaces and to royalty who were coming to listen to it. So that was really fascinating for me.
Agreed. That's wonderful. So could you tell us, Joanne, a little bit more about how your article extends existing knowledge in musicology, kind of where we know things right now, or a particular subfield, or even other broader discussions about music?
Well, I think the symphony is such an established genre. It's such a prestigious genre with so much written about it. And there's some really well-established narratives and writers, like Karl Dahlhaus, obviously, is one of the most iconic, well-known people to have written about the 19th century symphony. And so in some ways there's not much left to be said, but in other ways there's so much left to be said. And I found it fascinating trying to pick apart some of these really established narratives, and particularly looking at what Karl Dahlhaus calls this dead period for the symphony. That's like post Beethoven, but we haven't got to Brahms yet. And this period in the middle where there's still quite a lot being written, but for Dahlhaus, nothing particularly important, I suppose. So it's quite nice to look at that again and think, actually, there's some really important, interesting things going on here that can tell us all sorts of stuff about what role the symphony in the article played for people, and how it can tell us so much about how people were thinking about their national identity at the time, and different ways of the symphony isn't just kind of one thing. It's all sorts of different things to people, and there are all sorts of different models for writing symphonies. And I think we can kind of lose sight of that if we get too swept up in these kind of large scale narratives. And I think the other kind of main contribution or thing that my article talks to is this regional approach to music studies, which I think we're seeing more and more of. We've had a lot about the nation and music. We've had a lot about transnationalism recently. And I think having this slightly more micro approach gives you a lot of the nuances, but also then you can learn some quite broad lessons from it. And hopefully I've shown that in my article, that there are, that even though it's quite zoning in on smaller areas, what it can do in terms of problematizing these broader narratives is really, really important, I think.
So last question for us today, Joanna. What would you like a student or somebody who is new to musicology to take away from your article?
I think there are a couple of things. I think one is don't be afraid to go back to this well-trodden ground and do it again. There is always something new to be learned, and there are always different ways of looking at things. And I think one thing I always really like to do is to think about what are these large narratives and the assumptions sitting behind them, and why do we think of these? Why do we kind of come up with these stories about how to understand history? What are the assumptions behind that? and what are the things that don't fit in with those stories and those larger narratives? Because I think it's often those things that don't quite fit, that's where all the juicy material is. So these two symphonies, they don't really fit in with established narratives of the symphony in the 19th century and what it is, and this kind of liberal view of national identity. And there are, like the Lachner, there's all sorts of different ways of thinking about that one, which come across in the article. And the Meyer one is a bit too conservative to fit in with the prevailing view. But they're really, really rich for what they do tell us. So I think looking at those things, the things that don't quite fit the established narratives, would be the other lesson, I think, to come from my article.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Joanne, for joining us today and for talking a bit about your work. Be sure to check out Joanne's essay, along with other fabulous articles and reviews that are in the most recent JAMS issue, Volume 78, Issue 2, which is available through the University of California Press. Happy reading, everybody.